Concentration is an inherently unbalanced mechanic because not every class gets access to it. Gets access to it, but concentration is a limitation, you say. Which is weird because why would you say that? Concentration does feel like a limitation. It is presented as one. You can only have one concentration spell going at a time. If you take damage, you might lose it. Feels like a limitation, right? Only it is there to justify effects that would be too powerful if it didn't have concentration. Which begs the question then, it doesn't beg a question, but if you think about it for a second, like let's say you have, a 50% power spell does not require concentration, but a 100% power spell does. That extra 50% is being paid for by what is functionally a virtual action, if you will. This is going to sound crazy, but I will try to justify all these points. Your virtual action of concentrating on a spell. And so you're getting that extra bit of effectiveness out of your spell. Concentration spells have a tendency to be kind of either very powerful or very long-term ongoing effects. Oftentimes, equating to about the effectiveness of an action. So, like, for example, Spirit Guardians is concentration because it creates a zone that does damage periodically, regularly, one might say. Yeah. And it is roughly equivalent to, like, an action. Like, you wouldn't want that stacking with other similarly powerful effects. You only get one at a time. But if you think about it, classes without concentration don't get to have those effects. And I've already have a video on like how concentration is a weird mechanic and it encourages strange behavior because some concentration spells are better than others. That's not what this video is about. I'm comparing concentration to non-concentration. Imagine a system where all the spells were fair enough that they didn't require concentration. I will give you an example of one such a system, and you know which one it is. 4th edition did not have a concentration mechanic. It did have a sustain mechanic, where spells that can do damage regularly require your action to reactivate or to maintain. Either a standard action, usually if you're making an additional attack, or a minor action, usually if it's like a zone of like difficult terrain or blocking terrain or whatever it might be. Usually it's one of those two. Summon effects would require your standard action to attack, your move action to command them to move, minor actions occasionally for additional benefits. But it required your actions to do, which is why you don't need concentration for summoning effects in 4th edition, because although the creature stays there without having to sustain the spell, it doesn't do anything unless you spend actions on it, druids aside. Druids have special summons that have an instinctive effect that they do even if they get no orders. So there are definitely ways to make spells more fair without taking concentration. But what does concentration add? Concentration is an additional resource. You have a concentration. You have one concentration. You know, if you want to think about it this way, instead of thinking of it as an action, which you absolutely can, but it might be easier, I think, to think of it as a resource. You know, imagine you have a separate spell slot. We'll call it a level C spell slot. In order to cast certain spells, you need to expend a spell slot of the spell's level, and then if it's concentration, you also expend your level C slot. You have this one binary resource. You either have it or you don't. So you are expending that to maintain the spell. Well, as soon as you stop maintaining the spell, you get that resource back and you can use it for something else. Or if you want to, you can cast another spell that takes concentration and just transfer it over there. So it's a non-expended resource. It is just occupied. You invest it into a spell. So this is a resource that other classes don't have. The fighter, the monk, the barbarian, and the rogue. They don't have concentration on any of their features. So it's a resource that they cannot utilize. Theoretically, you could say that they have it. You know, if they somehow gain the ability to cast a concentration spell, they can use it on that. But they don't have any inbuilt ways to use it. And it is a resource that is used for the very most powerful effects in the game. Some of them. If you think about it, there are a lot of powerful spells that don't require concentration either because they're instantaneous or permanent or they're force cage, you know. But most of the most powerful spells in 5th edition require concentration, and that is spending or investing a resource that other classes just don't have access to. And I don't think there's any way to make that fair. You know, because you could say like, oh, well, let's bump up all of the other features for the marshals so that they don't need concentration. But then if it's fair, if the marshals are brought up to the level of spellcasters using concentration, which they basically can't be. Casters are so ridiculously overpowered that you'll never justify bringing 5th edition marshals up to that level. No one will accept it because they actually go off the wall with power in spells. Like by the time you hit 5th level, 3rd level spells are incredibly strong. 7th level and above spells are just campaign breaking. That's why usually campaigns end by level 12. You know, it's just too hard to run a game when 7th level spells are being thrown around. But anyways, let's say you did bring marshals up to that level. Well, then what benefit is it to be a spellcaster? To have all of your resources just match what someone else is doing without those resources? That's not fair. Which kind of brings it back down to, I just realized my lights are on. Let me turn my lights off for fucking there. It was rainy earlier when I was driving, so I turned my lights on so people can see me, because I'm a smart little boy. There's, where entirely was I? This actually kind of boils down to the whole conceit of 5th edition, which is that classes can have different resource mechanics, including no resource mechanic at all, aside from hit points, and still try to operate in the same theater. And I think it's a false premise. I think it is incorrect to think that that can happen. Now, obviously, you can do it. It just creates a ton of problems. It's basically impossible to have a game where you are fair to both casters and marshals when only casters get resources. I don't think there's any way to make that work. And that is before you even get into the issues that the concentration mechanic actually creates by having some spells be gated behind it so that you can't use them when you're using the better concentration spells, which I've already talked about. Concentration is inherently unfair. That's the premise of this video. Concentration cannot be fair. The only way to fix spellcasting is to make spells work without concentration. Which would be a lot of work. If you were revamping the 5e spellcasting system, you would have to go through every single spell and reevaluate it in terms of some kind of objective resource evaluation and decide exactly what that evaluation is while bringing martial characters up to that level. And that's just tons of work. That is a new system. And it kind of brings up the question of like, how much can you change about a system before it becomes a new system? It becomes an entirely new game. I don't have a good answer for that. The game of Theseus is something that has come up quite a bit. And I don't have a solution for it, but it does seem like every time I think, 5th edition would be better if, fill in the blank, if concentration were taken out, if marshals had a resource to spend on abilities, if, feats weren't tied, feats didn't take up your class progression, if extra attack was acknowledged as a fake feature that is automatically incorporated into cantrips and shouldn't take up class progression there either. 5th edition would be a better game if blank. And what I'm finding is that really what it boils down to is that 5th edition would be a better game if it was a different game. And I don't think there's any way around that conclusion that I've been coming to lately. There's just so much to fix, and it all requires that you fix kind of everything at once, because all of the problems are interlaced with each other. Most of the problems tie into multiclassing. I've talked about that at length, but the entire way that spellcasting is constructed is problematic to its core at every level. So, and concentration is a big part of that. I don't know if it's necessarily a big part of it. It is part of it. It's like 20, 30% of the problem, which is a significant chunk, but it is not most of it.